Everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Ensuring the Best Possible Slide Quality Every Time. I'm Cassie Saltman of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots and brought to you by ELITechGroup. To learn more, visit www.elitechgroup.com. We encourage you to participate today by submitting any questions you may have during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box in the lower left and click Submit. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. You may also submit any technical issues here as well if you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation. I'd like to now welcome our speakers, Bryan Keisel, Service and Application Support Manager at ELITechGroup, and Chad Clay, Lead Application Support Specialist at ELITechGroup. Bryan, you may now begin your portion of the presentation.
Hello, my name is Bryan, and I am happy to be going over some of the best practices for slide staining. I know everyone's got a little bit different background, so I'm going to start off with just some of the very basics and go through some of the things that we use slide staining for. And then after, Chad is going to go through some of the more details on what types of things we see that causes issues and the things we see that are best practices that can help ensure we have the best quality slide every time. Blood smears are a critical diagnostic tool. In just a few minutes, you can provide a clinician with a lot of information that can really change the course of treatment for a patient. For example, the image on the left is of CSF from a child with acute headaches. You can clearly see gram-positive diplococci in pairs, which indicates bacterial meningitis. The clinician may have already suspected meningitis, but this confirmation will solidify the diagnosis. If no bacteria were seen, then the clinician may lean towards viral meningitis, which has a very different treatment plan, but would also take additional testing to confirm. On the image on the right, it shows gram-negative rods from a wound. Often gram-negative rods are more antibiotic resistant, so that might also alter the course of treatment. While there are many bacteria that show as gram-negative rods, that information gives clues to how the clinician should begin treatment while antibiotic susceptibility testing is being performed. Blood smears are also a great way of being able to visualize metabolic processes and genetic disorders. When viewing a peripheral blood slide, there are many adjectives that are used to communicate to the clinician what is being seen in the blood. For red blood cells alone, it is not uncommon to see macrocytosis or microcytosis, which are describing the size of this red blood cells, hypochromic and hyperchromic, and even polychromic, which all describe the color of the red blood cells, which usually indicates the hemoglobin concentration. And there's a whole bunch about the shape. There's spherocytes and dacrocytes, or teardrop cells, target cells, acanthocytes, which are spur cells, stomatocytes, and echinocytes. So all those just describe the shape of the red blood cells. And each of these characteristics is another clue to the clinician about what's happening in the patient. We could go through countless examples, but on this slide we see a patient with sickle cell anemia on the left, which is caused by a mutation in the gene for hemoglobin. This causes the red blood cells to take on a sickle shape. The middle image is of a patient with iron deficiency anemia. This usually shows with hyperchromia and anisocytosis, which is red blood cells in various sizes. Hemolytic anemia is seen in the image on the right. There you can see polychromasia and poikilocytosis, which is various shaped red blood cells. Blood smears are also very valuable in identification, differentiation, and treatment monitoring of leukemias. In leukemia, abnormal, immature white blood cells multiply uncontrollably, which fills up bone marrow and spill out into circulation. This hinders the production of red blood cells and platelets. Leukemia is a diverse group of blood cancers based on the white blood cell line affected and how quickly it progresses. There's not time here to go into the details and identification of all the various leukemias and lymphomas, but seeing these blasts or progenitor cells out in circulation is a red flag for anyone reading blood smears. Platelet disorders can be caused by genetic abnormalities, autoimmune disorders, as well as blood and bone marrow diseases. They are most commonly identified by the size and amount of the platelets on the cell. Rarely megakaryocytes, which are the progenitor cells of platelets, are seen and should be cause for concern if they are seen. In this slide, you'll see a normal patient count on the left in comparison with the abnormal one on the right. Obviously, there are far more platelets on the right, and they are of various sizes, which we would call platelet anesiocytosis. In blood smears, a good quality slide begins with how the smear is made. It can't be too thick or too thin, and consistency is critical. Creating a good quality blood smear can sometimes feel like an art. It can take a lot of practice and trial and error, but once you get the hang of it, it will be a useful laboratory skill even if your lab uses an automated slide maker. As a former field service engineer, I know that almost anything mechanical can have issues. Most laboratorians learn to create blood smears by putting a drop of blood near the frosted edge of a slide, and then using another slide to let you wick blood across the width of that slide. Once the blood has gone across the slide, you then push the drop across the length of the slide. The goal is to create a consistent layer of cells about 1 cell thick. This is referred to as the monolayer. This is where you will be able to see the best morphology and get an even absorption of stain. Once you see the process, it looks simple, but it can take a lot of practice to perfect. Here with this first slide, you can see a very short, thick smear with little to no monolayer. It could have been caused by many things, from the angle of the pushing slide being too great, using too much pressure, or simply allowing the blood to sit for too long and begin clotting before making the slide. This slide shows a much improved monolayer. It is seen at the end of the feathered edge just before it becomes translucent. Overall, the thickness and consistency are much better. The issue here is that nearly half of the slide on the bottom is missing entirely. This is most likely due to not allowing the blood to wick evenly across the slide in both directions before pushing it across. This is another very short, thick smear with little to no monolayer. Again, it could have been affected by the angle of the pushing slide or the pressure. One interesting difference here are the clear lines down the middle of the smear. This could have been caused by debris on the slide before applying the drop of blood, or maybe from impurities on the edge of the pushing slide. Here are a couple of examples of good but not perfect slides. You can see how the blood went all the way from the top to the bottom across the width of the slide, and there is even, consistent pressure as the blood is pushed across. There is good, even monolayer, and these slides should give great staining results. We've discussed the importance of being able to visualize infections, metabolic processes, and many other pertinent details. Unfortunately, the process is much more complicated than simply adding sample to a slide and looking at it under a microscope. Various stains are used depending on what you're looking for. There are many variations and specialty stains, but most stains will fall under one of these general categories. Gram stains for bacterial slides, Romanowski stains for hematology, and Papanicolaou stains to view cellular components. Each one of these stains are actually a combination of stains, washes, and counterstains, all of which are designed to highlight various microscopic aspects of a cell. As you can see on this slide, without stain, you're very limited on what you can visualize. While talking about body fluids, we should note that many of the fluids that are tested in a laboratory will have a very low cellular concentration. Instead of hunting around a slide all day for the few cells that may be there, most laboratories will perform a cytocentrifugation of the sample. There are many different methods of cytocentrifugation, but they all share the same concept. In general, a liquid sample is placed in a chamber and then loaded into a centrifuge with the sample slide. As the centrifugal force pushes the liquid and cells outwards, they land onto the sample slide. There is usually some sort of a pad to absorb the majority of the extracellular fluid. The cells that then remain on the slide will be in a small area and much easier to find. Keep in mind that due to the forces, there will be some deformation of the cells as seen in this image of eosinophils in CSF fluid. Once you have a slide, now we have to stain the slide. And we'll go into more details on the staining process, but just an overview of how you would perform a manual slide stain. So if you're going to do a hematology slide, once it's collected, you have to prepare the smear, as we've talked. Then you have to fix it on the slide. Usually that's with methanol. Once it's been fixed, you have to dip in eosin, followed by a thiazine stain, and then you have to rinse it out. Now, this specifics on how long you leave in the eosin, how long you leave in the thiazine, is there a rinse in between, and how you perform that? That's going to vary lab to lab depending on what was validated. But once you get the slide done, you will then put it under a microscope and use an oil immersion lens usually, locate the monolayer, perform differential. Depending on your workflow, you might have to have a pathologist verify it, and then you can have the results sent out to the clinician. Similar workflow for the gram staining. Once the sample is collected, if you need to, you can do the Sutter centrifugation as we've talked about, and then it needs to be fixed on the slide. You can either air dry it or you can heat fix it, low heat. And then normally for a gram stain, you have to use crystal violet to stain it. Iodine is mordant that helps the stain set in. You then use acetone to decolorize all the gram negatives, followed by safranin, which is a counter stain. Once that counter stain is done, you rinse off the slide, look at it under a oil immersion lens, perform the examination, and get those results sent out to the clinician. Again, how long you leave in the crystal violet and the exact steps for the iodine, mordant, as well as acetone and safranin, those all vary depending on the reagents used and your lab's specific workflow.
Here's an example hand staining setup for blood smears. One can use ELITech's Aerofix as a fixative, the red dye eosin, and finally the blue thiazine dye for staining. Here's a top-down view of the staining setup. The first thing we're going to do is place the blood smear into the fixative, which we've decided to go with absolute methanol for. Most protocols require only a single dip or few seconds in the methanol for fixation. Once that's finished, we're going to remove the slide and allow it to completely air dry. Then we're going to take our slide into the combined eosin thiazine solution and leave for 1 minute. Right now we are performing an example hand staining protocol with ELITech reagents, but other vendors' procedures and timings may be different. After staining, we're going to allow that stain to drain off as much as possible to prevent carryover, and then we're going to transfer the slide into our buffer reagent for rinsing. The buffer reagent is normally colorless, but is quickly colored bluish when rinsing the stain off and should be replaced after every couple of stain procedures. Now we are going to take a look at an example manual gram staining procedure. We start again by fixing the slide in methanol and also allowing the slide to completely air dry afterwards. We are then going to apply our crystal violet solution to the slide for 30 to 45 seconds. It's important to apply enough liquid to the slide to completely cover the sample and prevent drying. We're then going to rinse the slide carefully but thoroughly with deionized water or tap water. Excessive rinsing, as shown here, may impact the final stain. Our documented procedure suggests rinsing briefly for no more than 5 seconds. We're then going to apply our iodine solution to the slide for 45 to 60 seconds, again making sure to flood the slide with enough solution to fully cover the specimen. When possible, avoid using a spray bottle as seen in this video because an intense stream of water might loosen the sample and cause it to fall off the slide. We suggest running the slide in gently running tap water instead. ELITechGroup combines the decolorizer and counterstain into a single efficient solution. Apply the decolorizer for 20 seconds for thin smears. Again, we suggest rinsing in gently running tap water instead of a spray bottle when possible. If the slide appears under decolorized, reapply decolorizer and repeat the rinse. For some gram staining protocols, it's good practice to apply the decolorizer dropwise. This helps visualize the crystal violet being pulled from the gram-negative bacteria.
While hand staining might be the cheapest option, there are some issues that come along with it. The first is that it's time-consuming. It's not so much that it's significantly slower, but that you have to have somebody that sits and babysits that slide all the way through. That means that person, if they get interrupted or if something happens or their question comes up, it can affect the slides that are in that stain, so that one person is just out of commission while that stain is taking place. Most labs today are very busy and people are expected to do multiple things, so that can be a big damper on the throughput of that lab. The second is that not all technicians are trained, and even if they are trained, there's going to be a lot of variability. For instance, does one person, do they shake after each stain? How long do they shake and how vigorous? Do they dab off the excess stain? Do they swirl up the slide when it's in the stain? There's a lot of things that would have to be, even if they're specified in the SOP or the procedure, you're still going to have variability between two technicians. So that might end up that the pathologist favors one technician over another, and it can just stir up a lot of issues there. And similarly, there's a lack of quality control. So unless each person runs a QC slide each shift, there's going to be variability between each person. And even if they do run that quality control slide, unless they're doing the exact same procedure with their patient slides, then you're going to have that variability. One of the biggest issues is the potential for cross-contamination. Often these stains are performed with Copland jars that are filled with stain, and you dip the slides in. The nice thing is you can sometimes do multiple slides at once, so that helps make things consistent. But there's a risk that the cells from slide A, that patient cells might adhere to the patient B slide. So you might have cross-contamination of those cells, and even if they don't adhere to the slide in that same batch, there's potential that the subsequent slides that are dipped in that stain are going to get those cells on them. So those are some of the things you have to watch out for and be aware of as you're doing the hand staining method. If you're not doing very many, and it's just once in a while, it might be the way to go, depending on your lab and your lab's financial situation. But there's definitely going to be some issues as you go along that route.
We are now going to demonstrate how the ELITech Aerospray Pro instrument works for blood smears. It is critical that the slides are loaded in the carousel correctly, facing clockwise with the frosted edge to the hub and on top of the corresponding number of the slide. Then reattach the top of the carousel. For reagents, the Aerospray Pro uses a buffer, thiazine dye, eosin, and methanol for fixation. To start a run, simply load the carousel into the chamber and close the lid. There are several programs to choose from, but you may also edit your own protocol to your preferences. The instrument begins by fixing the slides. All fixing and staining of the slides is achieved by rotating the carousel around the center hub while spraying reagent onto the slides. After the slides have been fixed, the instrument applies a mixed concentration of thiazine and eosin to the slides. Each program can be customized to have a different number of stain applications, wait times, and spin settings. We're going to fast forward through these steps, but as you can see, there's a display bar that gives the percentage completion of each step. After the concentrate stain, the instrument will perform a mid-rinse of the slides. This is done with either a 6.8 or 7.2 pH buffer solution. This step can also be adjusted to increase or decrease the amount of rinsing performed. Then the instrument can apply a diluted version of the stain. This mixes the thiazine and eosin stains with pH-controlled buffer before applying to the slide. The combination of the concentrate and diluted stain give colors that perfectly mimic your standard Wright, Giemsa, and May Grunwald stains. After applying the diluted version of the stain, the instrument will do a final wash with buffer. This step can also be programmed to provide more or less rinsing. And finally, the instrument will dry the slides using the Aerospray's unique centrifugation capabilities. The instrument will give brief sprays of methanol while centrifuging at a safe speed to quickly dry the slides. This is known as the dry time and can also be adjusted in settings. The goal is to have microscope-ready slides by the end of the procedure. The instrument shows 100% and can give an audible noise when the run is complete. After the cycle is complete, simply remove the carousel, take off the top, and you'll see here that the slides have the nice expected purple color and are ready to be viewed under the microscope or ran on a slide analyzer.
This slide is very similar to the slide we just showed a second ago, but now I placed a red box around those functions that are normally done by an automated stainer. Now, some stainers are going to be a little bit different, and there's many different stainers on the market, but generally they're going to replace these steps. And so you can see you still need to prepare your sample, and you're still going to look at it underneath the microscope. But that middle chunk where you are actually having to physically move it from one stain to the next, that's what's being replaced. You still have to make sure you're aware, if your automated instrument is using a dip method, you still have that same potential for cross-contamination. And I know most manufacturers have policies and procedures in place to try to mitigate that. If your automated system is a spray system or a dripping or a wicking method, then you have to make sure you understand that you are relying on the movement of various fluids and various stains. So you have to really make sure that instrument is well maintained so that you are getting those stains are actually doing what you expect them to do. So when you're using an automated stainer, one of the most important things is to make sure that everyone using the stainer is trained and knowledgeable on how to use it, as well as making sure that it is well maintained and that everything is functioning well before you stain your slides.
Thank you, Brian. For this portion of the webinar, I'm going to continue to focus on potential pitfalls and how to avoid them. As part of achieving a high-quality slide, we want to avoid anything that can interfere with pulling accurate diagnostic information from the sample. Unfortunately, there can be things that are present on the slides that have nothing to do with the sample or are caused by the way the sample is processed. You're probably already familiar with the term artifact, so you know I'm not referring to the ones archaeologists look to discover in ancient dig sites. These are artifacts that we wish to avoid coming across. One definition I found is a phenomenon or feature not originally present or expected and caused by an interfering external agent, action, or process. And I think that's a pretty suitable definition for us here. Starting off with blood, one of the first potential pitfalls would be in the collection. If you don't collect enough blood in your EDTA tube, the concentration of EDTA per volume of blood is higher than normal and can lead to morphological artifacts under the microscope. In general, the time from collection to smear and staining should be minimized as much as possible. Then after we collect the blood, we're probably going to store it, even if for just a short time. Samples should be stored refrigerated if possible, because when stored at room temperature, morphological changes can occur in white and red blood cells in as short as 8 hours. Red blood cell crenation is one of the most common artifacts that occurs with storage and sample handling issues. And here to the right is a picture of what those look like. If you work with blood samples under the microscope, this is going to be a familiar image. This type of artifact can be caused by many different things. A well-made blood smear should be 2/3 to 3/4 in length of the slide, with a slight rounding at the feathered edge to provide the largest area for examination. The smear should be thin enough that only a few erythrocytes are touching in 100x filled. The size of the blood drop used, the patient red blood cell count, the angle at which the spreader slide is held, and the speed at which the slide is made all affect the thickness of the blood smear. If you've made blood smears before, you know that without practice, it can be difficult to consistently give perfect smears. If you work in a large enough laboratory, perhaps the instrument makes the smears for you. But there's also really helpful benchtop devices that can perfectly make consistent slides every time. I'd suggest getting one of these if making smears by hand is a problem. We might ask ourselves, why is a good smear so important? Well, we simply don't want to make anything out of the ordinary that can be confused with true diagnostic clues. And don't worry, you can always remake the smear if you have more blood. Another reason might be that your automated slide reader has requirements for the smear in order to process the slide. I know the CellVision can fail to read the slide for things like not being able to identify enough of a monolayer. Many samples require concentration before being applied to a glass slide. One of the best ways to process these samples is with a cytocentrifuge. Cytocentrifuges act as centrifuge the sample directly onto a glass slide while pulling excess liquid from the sample into an absorbent pad. One thing to note is that cellular recovery is not perfect, which means that although your entire sample was centrifuged onto the slide, cells can also lyse or get pulled into the absorbent pad with excess liquid. This leads to a significantly less amount of cells on your slide than was present in the sample. One thing we've noticed is that not all cytocentrifuges are equal in their cellular recovery. One independent study using ELITech's CytoPro cytocentrifuge showed a 5 to 9-fold increase in the number of cells on a slide. Another way to improve cellular recovery is to load a pre-wet tunnel or chamber with buffer, which allows this to be the first liquid to be pulled into the absorbent pad instead of your sample. Furthermore, I'd strongly suggest using slides coated with polyl-lysine, which is a charged chemical that helps cells bind to the slide. For some samples, albumin can be added to help with cellular recovery and stabilizing fragile cells. Routine cytocentrifugation of body fluid samples can cause morphologic artifacts, as shown in this image. You can see how the nuclei seem stretched and distorted, and the nucleoli appear more prominent than normal. Incorrect cytocentrifuge speed and time settings can accentuate these artifacts. Too high of a spin speed may damage the cells and further distort morphology, whereas too low of a spin speed or time results in potentially leaving liquid on the slide or in the sample chamber. Another important note is to remember that RPMs, or rotations per minute, is different than actual relative centrifugal force, and you'll need to take into account the radius of the centrifuge when switching to new centrifuges. It's also important to make sure the sample you load has the right amount of cells to begin with. Too many cells and they will be crowded and overlapping, whereas too few may not give a good enough monolayer to pull diagnostic information from. I want to pivot here and talk a little bit about staining and stain theory. Understanding how staining works can also help us avoid artifacts and pitfalls associated with the staining process. So when staining blood and bone marrow, we are usually using a Romanowski stain, which can be considered a group of stains that utilizes a blue stain, usually methylene blue and azures, in conjunction with a red stain, usually eosin Y. There also might be some amount of buffer for washing and diluting involved. As you may know, there are several variants of this type of stain. There's a Giemsa, Wright, May-Grunwald, and even quick diffs, and all these operate in a similar manner. In general, stains act by binding to components within the cell, usually through ionic bonding, but other methods of binding are also utilized. Eosin is a negatively charged dye, while methylene blue and azure can hold a positive charge. When these dyes come together in the nucleus, you see what is known as a Romanowski-Giemsa effect, which is a characteristic purple color only present in the nuclei and neutrophil granules. This purple effect may be lessened in single solution dyes with high methanol content. As with most stains, the pH is critical. Each dye must be ionized and the correct color for a successful stain. The ionization of components of the cell that bind the dyes are also controlled by the pH. Ideally, Romanowski stains need a pH of 6.8 to 7.2 for correct staining. Now that we know a little bit about how the staining works, let's talk about potential issues that might arise as a result of an unsuccessful stain. First off, it's important to know that every stain may give slightly different results based on its exact formula, so it's important to keep in mind who made the stain and how they made it. Usually these stains are moderately buffered, so drifting pH isn't a major concern. However, if the color of the stain seems off, it might be worth double checking. Don't forget that these stains will sometimes require mixing with a buffer, so it's ultimately the pH of the final staining solution we need to check, not the stock solutions. As with most dyes, these stains eventually degrade once mixed with methanol or water, so it's important to keep an eye on the expiration date. When we think back to the ionization of the stains, it's also important to realize that the red and blue stains are opposite charges and can bind each other. However, this only occurs in bulk when the stains are diluted significantly in water, aka your buffer. This is why mixed stock solutions of these dyes are mostly methanol. Some procedures will have you mix the dyes with buffer just before use and then discard that working solution immediately afterwards. This is because, again, the dye is precipitate in water. This is a photo of excess precipitate on the slide. It's a little difficult to see, but you may notice that the precipitate can have the exact same color as the stained nuclei, showing that you have a combination of eosin and an azure. If these precipitates aren't fully washed off or prevented, they can overlap RVCs and mimic all sorts of real diagnostic conditions. There are many other artifacts that might be present due to an unsuccessful staining process. One problem that can be encountered is when your sample dries out during staining. If a stain is present on the slide when this happens, this means that the stain is hyperconcentrated and cellular components that normally don't stain may uptake stain. This issue can be fixed with excessive rinsing, but it's better to simply monitor your stain in the first place. Drying out can also lead to formations of precipitate in some cases. It's important to remember that stains dissolved in alcohols are much more prone to drying out due to the alcohol having a higher evaporation rate than water. Drying, in some instances, can leave air pockets on the cells, such as seen in squamous cells, usually during a Papanicolaou stain. There may be some cases where characteristics of the sample must be compatible with the stain protocol, such as in a thick smear. Here is a photo of a gram stain in which the thick section of the smear is falsely colored pink instead of purple. This can occur in thick areas because stains and other decolorizers and rinsing solutions may require more time to take effect on multi-layered smears. Timing of staining protocols may need to be adjusted for these thick smears. Water everywhere. Water might seem harmless in the laboratory, but for Romanowski staining it can lead to several artifacts and difficulty viewing under a microscope. Excess humidity in labs, usually over 30% relative humidity, can lead to water or drying artifact on blood and bone marrow smears. It's thought that this happens when the smears are made and slides are slowly drying in a humid environment. This results in water spotting that sits on top of the RBCs, obscuring the cytoplasm and morphology. This drying artifact can also be described as giving a moth-eaten appearance of the red blood cells. It's also thought that when the methanol used to initially fix the slides has greater than 3% of water contamination, it cannot remove the water artifact from the cells and may actually contribute to the issue. Unfortunately, methanol is very prone to absorbing water out of the atmosphere, especially in humid laboratories, so keep your methanol containers tightly sealed as much as possible. Humidity in slowly drying slides is also thought to be one cause of burr cells, also known as echinocytes, an artifact we've previously discussed. There are a couple ways to prevent these water issues from happening. First, if possible, try to reduce the humidity in the lab by using a dehumidifier. Then, it's common for labs to try to increase the speed at which the slide dries by using an electric fan or by waving the slides in the air after making the smear. If you're concerned your methanol is old or has absorbed too much water, simply use fresh methanol from your stock container. And finally, several commercial formulations of methanol fixative for Romanowski staining will contain an additive that helps the methanol remain anhydrous. ELITech's version of this is the Aerofix for our aerospray instruments. Water can also be a nuisance when it comes to viewing the slide under the microscope. If your clearant or dehydration alcohols become contaminated with water, this can leave your slides looking cloudy or hazy. This often happens when old contaminated alcohols are transferred to your xylene or substitute along with the slide. I already mentioned this in the previous slide, but it's important to remember to keep your alcohols tightly sealed or to routinely swap them out for fresh solutions. Another quick reminder on some of the main causes for samples coming off of slides. The main culprit is usually a smear that is too thick. Along with staining, this can interfere with the fixation process, and any charge or albumin on the slide intended to hold the sample to the slide cannot reach upper layers of a smear. Smears also dry and stick together pretty well, so it's common that entire chunks of thick smears will come off at the same time. For anyone performing immunohistochemistry, it's important to allow the slides to completely dry after mounting a ribbon section on the glass. One suggestion is to dry the slides vertically, then bake the slides vertically to make sure any water below the paraffin completely runs out and dries. Paraffin quality is also important in that instance. Old and brittle paraffin is more difficult to use. Another quick note on IHC is that higher pH reagents, such as your antigen retrieval buffer, can contribute to tissue falling off the slide. In that instance, I'd suggest using a lower pH retrieval solution. Again, in both histology and cytology, if there's an issue with sample loss on the slides, then use coated slides. It's not as common, but every now and then you might come across some slides that need to be cleaned of dirt, dust, or oil that may interfere with your sample adhesion. Now I'd like to take a closer look at the gram stain, which has several pitfalls that can give confusing results. First off, let's quickly remind ourselves that this stain utilizes dyes, a mordant, and a decolorizer to give pink gram-negative bacteria and purple gram-positive bacteria. More organisms than bacteria are stained by this procedure, but in general, it's the difference in the cell walls of the bacteria that allow the stain to be held or decolorized. For this reason, there's a decent list of artifactual results we'll want to be aware of. Reasons why your gram-negative bacteria are falsely purple could be insufficient decolorization. As we discussed earlier, especially with thicker smears, there needs to be enough time for the liquid to access all the cells. Otherwise, your gram-negative cells will simply remain purple. When expecting only certain species and morphologies, contamination of the sample from the skin is a concern. There's quite a bit of other artifacts that can cause your gram-positive sample to appear falsely pink. For one, make sure that the organism in question isn't known already to be somewhat gram variable, which means it can commonly stain both pink and purple. Then, again, if the smear is too thick, perhaps your crystal violet or iodine didn't reach layers of the bacteria sufficiently to stain. The use of antibiotics can degrade cell walls, leading to gram-positive bacteria staining pink also. The cell wall can also be damaged by excessive heat fixation, although most labs have turned to methanol fixation, which is commonly known as a much better fixative for gram samples. Excessive rinsing between steps can also interfere with the reagent's action, leading to this issue as well. And we have to remember that the mordant is critical to binding the crystal violet into the peptidoglycan cell wall, so ensure enough solution and time is given to the iodine step. Over-decolorization is a difficult thing to deal with in this stain. Depending on the decolorizer you're using, even decolorizing for an extra few seconds can lead to this. This is usually why the decolorizer is performed drop-wise in manual gram staining. And finally, when running control samples or slides, it's important to remember that gram-positive organisms lose their ability to retain the violet dye as they move out of the exponential growth phase. So you'll need to closely monitor the age and concentration of the colony if you are looking for perfectly staining gram-positive controls. I also wanted to quickly go over cytology staining and some issues that we see here specifically. As you may know, we are using the Papa-Nicolau stain here, which is a very complex and beautiful stain. However, there are some things that you want to look out for. Again, we see thick samples falling off as the main issue here. And we mentioned this previously, but not by name, but this issue in this photo here is known as cornflaking, because the cells can look like cornflakes under the scope. The cause of this is when air bubbles get trapped under the mountain and cover slip. This happens when the cells take on air, usually after clearing in xylene, but can happen at any point throughout the staining process too. The way to avoid this is to never allow the slide to dry at any time during the procedure, and if needed, cover slip only one slide at a time. If you clear 5 to 10 slides at a time and pull them out and cover slip, the last couple of slides will have sat in the air for longer than suggested and may exhibit this cornflaking. And again, remember the alcohols pull water out of the air, so it's important that your final dehydration alcohols are kept fresh or tightly sealed between usage. Otherwise, your slides, especially with this stain, may appear hazy under the microscope.
That wraps up the presentation, and I'll hand it back over for the Q&A session. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Brian and Chad, for your informative presentations. We will now start the live Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on the Ask a Question box located on the lower left of your screen, and we'll answer as many questions as we have time for today. Let's go ahead and get started. Our first question asks, what are some ways to make labs more efficient in light of staffing issues?
Yeah, I can take that one. So I haven't been to a lab in a long time that hasn't had staffing issues. I think it's very common across all labs I've ever been to. One of the best ways that labs are dealing with that is to try to allow those technologists to be able to multitask. So if you are hand staining, that's a difficult challenge because it's already challenging enough to get the same consistent result every time you're doing a stain. If you're using an automated stainer, that gives you that freedom that you can go ahead and you can start the staining over here, and then you can be processing something on the other table. You can be doing some other work. So doing some of that multitasking is always very beneficial. Also, one of the benefits of making sure everything is correct the first time is it minimizes the number of reruns you're going to have. So if you know that your instrument is producing the best slides every time, then you're not going to have to spend that time to redoing the same work that you've already done over and over again. It's just a waste of time and money. One other benefit that our instrument has is that it combines a cytocentrifuge with a stainer. So not only does that save in time, because it's only one instrument to know and to maintain, but also it's less counter space. It's been a long time since I've been in a lab that has a ton of extra counter space. Usually that's at a premium as well. So being able to do two things in one instrument is also very beneficial.
Fantastic. Thank you. Our next question that we have here asks, can Leishman stain be performed?
Yeah, I'll attempt to answer this one here. So I think we're referring to Leishman staining here on the Aerospray Pro. As far as some validated official settings released by ELITech, I don't think we've done anything there, but we have had customers who have done some settings that can mimic the colors of the Leishman, and a little bit of internal testing here as well. So if you just want to get with us after the presentation here, we can chat about some of those settings and how you can mimic the Leishmans.
Great, thank you. All right, our next question here says, hi, you see in picture you use methanol, not fixative solution, and second, you do not use guard slides. Is it possible?
Yeah, I'll jump on that one as well. We have another question as well that mentioned that we didn't use blocking slides in the video there, and that was a mistake. You 100% have to always use blocking slides with the Aerospray. So yes, definitely use the blocking slides. And as far as the methanol and not a fixative solution, for the Aerospray Pro stainer, you can use both methanol or our AeroFix fixative solution. Both of those will work. We offer the AeroFix as another measure to help with water spotting. So, but both of those should work.
Thank you. All right, our next question here asks, what can you do to save money and or lower waste?
One probably falls to me. So saving money is always, just like with the staffing issues, budgets are always very tight, especially in lab. Everyone's been asked to do more with less. If your lab can afford an automated analyzer, it's definitely the way to go. As we talked before, there's so much less waste as far as having to redo your samples. Your pathologist will be much happier knowing that the same sample quality is going to be there time after time after time, not having to worry about who's working and what kind of slides that tech is going to produce. But one thing to make sure of, whether it's an automated stainer or a hand staining method, is you got to make sure you're doing your maintenance. And it's especially critical on an automated stainer. So the automated stainer, you are relying on pumps and motors and whatever else to do the motion that your hand would be doing, which is great because it's going to be consistent. It's going to do the same thing every time. But if that pump isn't working right, if you haven't primed it correctly, if you haven't cleaned it correctly, if you have nozzles, if you have whatever other orifices that's dripping or spraying, all those have got to do the same thing every time. And the manufacturer designed them to do that same thing every time. They've also developed those to be done using that correct maintenance. So believe it or not, doing the maintenance, even though it might feel like you're wasting a bunch of methanol and wasting a bunch of reagent, doing that is going to actually make sure that you are going to be able to guarantee that good quality stain and not have to rework the same work over and over again, which in turn is going to not only increase or decrease costs, but it's going to increase the confidence that the clinician has in your results.
Great, thank you. And it looks like we have another question here that asks, can you please explain once more how to use a Leishman stain?
Yeah, I'll take that one real quick here. So what that would be for our Aerospray Pro is basically certain settings. Our instrument allows you to change settings on everything from fixation to spin time to drying and altering the stain ratios. And so it's basically a set of settings there that you would set on your instrument that would mimic what a Leishman stain would look like.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Our next question here asks, is EBS thinking about making disposable waste containers in the future?
I'll take that one. So honestly, I don't know if that's ever been brought up, but that's something we can definitely look into doing. I'm assuming because they get pretty dark and they look kind of nasty because of all the stain that sits in them all the time. So if that's the issue, then yeah, we can look at making them disposable. So you can just throw the cap on it and then throw the whole thing away instead of having all the liquid to throw out. So yeah, it's definitely something I can talk to our engineers about and see if that's something we can go through in the future. It's a great suggestion.
Wonderful, thank you. And if you have any questions for our speakers, now is the time to submit them. We have one more here in the queue before we are set to wrap up. So I'll ask that last one here. It says, we are seeing a lot of purple heavy precipitate throughout our blood smears on the Aerospray Pro. What do you recommend to fix this?
Yeah, so I'll take this. We definitely prefer that you contact our service group here. There's a couple of different things that could happen there. So if you give us a call or work with us through email, we'll walk you through several different things that you can troubleshoot to try to prevent that precipitate from happening. So yeah, please contact us after the presentation for that.
Yep, and that number is in the service manual, and it's also on the help screen on that instrument if you have an Aerospray. So you can talk to Chad face to face.
Perfect. Thank you. I want to thank you again for your time today and for your important research. We would also like to thank LabRoots and our sponsor, ELITechGroup, for underwriting today's educational webcast. Before we go, I'd like to thank our audience for joining us today and for their interesting questions. Questions we did not have time for today and those submitted during our on-demand period will be addressed by our speakers via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. This webcast can be viewed on demand. LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Until next time, take care, everyone. Goodbye.